Ever since the dawn of humanity, our species has looked after and adverted certain elements in our lives, such as certain objects, animals, and/or actions. All of this by means of having a form of reasoning which comes off as irrational, said behavior caused by consequences the individuals may have suffered, either by coincidences on certain situations or popular and religious beliefs. As such, these ideas and practices are conceived within the definition of superstitions, which still prevail to this day. The word has its origins in the ancient Latin word superstitio, literally translated as standing over, the Romans giving the meaning of bear witness or survive, and later on, this term would be associated towards those who engaged in exaggerated rituals and held credulous attitudes towards prophecies, its demonym superstitiosus referring negatively to those whom engaged in set rituals and beliefs, in fear of the gods that made up for Roman religion, with French philosopher Denis Diderot later defining the word as an excess of religion in general. The circles of motorsports aren't exempt of superstitions, as like any other sport, there exists a list of actions, aversions, and rituals which form part of its extensive lore with identical or similar means, which not only stem from popular beliefs, but also from the drivers' and riders' personal reasons for their practices, such as the opposition of using certain colors and numbers, wearing certain clothes, and most frequently, the rituals which have become popular with drivers and riders as time went by. From the routinary exercise of equipping their gear in a very specific pattern, to the process of preparing themselves before every session. Today, however, we'll talk about a manufacturer which, in the search of notoriety before one of the biggest markets in motorcycles, would go against the archetypes imposed by their popular beliefs, inadvertently creating some of its most distinguished elements, later on becoming part of the international identity for what is one of the most popular companies in the motorcycle industry, having hundreds of wins and titles on their behalf, many of these achieved with such iconic feature. This is the story of how Kawasaki adopted the color green, previously associated with bad omen. Our story has its roots in the US, a nation known by its extensive yet isolated motorsports culture, thanks to its severe differences from their categories. Thus, it allows for the creation of their own superstitions, such as the abstention of using the number 13 in any competition, as well as that of shaving during race day, and the peculiar grudge against eating peanuts, let alone getting near a driver or crew member while doing so. All of these conceived not only due to popular beliefs, but also attributed to several incidents which usually culminated with tragedy. The superstition surrounding the color green in American motorsports has its origins traced all the way back to the early days of auto racing, when in 1911, Kansas driver Lee Oldfield had participated in a race held at the now extinct Syracuse Mile, located in Syracuse, upstate New York, where he was fighting for the lead with Italian-American racing star Ralph De Palma, until his right front tire had exploded, causing Oldfield's Knox to swerve off the first corner and fly through the grandstands. The result of this accident causing the death of 11 spectators, with Oldfield surviving the horrible crash. 9 years later, French-Swissman Gaston Chevrolet, better known for being the co-founder of the Chevrolet Motor Company along with his brothers Louis and Arthur, as well as winning the 1920 Indy 500, had suffered a fatal accident in the Beverly Hills Speedway port track, in which he would collide with Eddie O'Donnell, the latter and his mechanic also becoming a fatality in this terrible incident, the common point of these two having a strange coincidence, with both Chevrolet and Oldfield having driven green-colored cars. The motorcycle community would also create their superstition surrounding the color, all thanks to a couple of theories originating from World War II. in which the American soldiers would ride motorcycles as means of either transporting important messages or crossing through the battlefields. However, their distinctive green color would make them an easy target for the enemies, and right after the war was over, these bikes would be sold for private use, their extensive usage accounting for multiple mechanical failures once they were back home, and thus the jinx surrounding the green color would be solidified. From this background, we now move on to the protagonist of this story, Kawasaki, an industrial conglomerate whose origins can be traced all the way back to 1878, when Japanese industrialist Shozo Kawasaki established his shipyard in Tokyo. And after becoming a prominent figure in the shipping industry, as well as his consolidation in Japanese politics, Kawasaki would manage to expand his company to many different areas by the turn of the century, diversifying to the railroad and aeronautical industries, playing a key role in the military by supplying most of the Imperial Army's warships and aircraft for their respective Navy and Air Forces. Once World War II was over, however, Kawasaki had seen their reach severely reduced, and like many other corporations in the post-war era, they had decided to move on to the motorcycle industry. Their venture starting in the 1950s through the affiliate company Meihatsu, and in 1960 they would associate themselves with a manufacturer known as Meguro, which had been previously established as an ironworks, and later on they would invest in Harley-Davidson during the Great Depression, thus obtaining several drawings, tools, and important knowledge for building motorcycles the following decade, creating a vast range of bikes heavily inspired from European brands. The company's success going as far as supplying their bikes to the Japanese imperial government for both police and military forces. Right after the war, however, poor sales due to elevated costs had put the company's integrity in danger. Thus, the affiliation with Kawasaki's aircraft division would materialize, and in 1962 it would be renamed Meguro Kawasaki. Less than 2 years, however, the company declared bankruptcy, and as such, it would be merged to form the now known Kawasaki Motorcycle Company. The second half of the 60s oversaw the Japanese industrial expansion, with many of its corporations starting their campaigns to conquer some of the biggest global markets, such as those of Europe and North America. And among the many industries they started to take over, it would be in motorcycles where they had their massive surge. Not to conform with that, the big Japanese four would also translate their success in sales to the circuits, winning more than 61 world championships in less than 10 years, starting what would be the notorious replacement of the European manufacturers in motorcycle road racing. Unlike their competitors, however, Kawasaki had a rather slow start in the World Grand Prix Championship, though once they managed to complete development of their bikes, success would be instantly met in 1969, when British rider Dave Simmons rode the red and white KA1 to a display of sheer domination, winning 8 of the 10 races he started, finishing no worse than second and crowning himself the 125cc world champion. However, just a few months prior to the start of such feat, one of the most important events in Kawasaki's history had taken place right on the other side of the Atlantic. Considered as one of the most important events in American motorcycle road racing, the Daytona 200, much like its four-wheeled counterpart, had its origins in the beaches of the homonymous location, which offered rather compact sands, allowing for an extensive amount of competitions to take place, starting with the establishment of land speed records between the 1920s and 30s. Sometime later, it will be occupied for stock car and motorcycle racing by using a shared layout split between the A1A freeway and Daytona Beach. However, as a response to the eventual growth in southern Florida, NASCAR's founder Bill France Sr. had decided to build one of the most ambitious projects of its time, a fast 2.5-mile oval for stock cars, along with an inner layout which allowed for many different categories to race in this new track, such as sports cars and motorcycles. The latter finally arriving to the now known Daytona International Speedway in 1961, with the Daytona 200 becoming not only one of the most important events in terms of marketing for motorcycle companies, but also attracting the greatest motorcycle racers from all over the globe. Just 8 years later, Kawasaki would make their presence in the Great American Motorcycle Race. Its American franchise decided to introduce the brand in a very special way, by approaching Californian painter Molly Sanders to suggest a color palette, the latter deciding for a lime green and white combination, as it would make the bikes stand out from the rest. And despite their initial objection due to the possible jinx, they would reluctantly agree, the new livery adorning their 250 and 350cc bikes, which participated in different categories, those being ridden by Dick Hammer, Walt Fulton, Ken Aralka, Art Bowman, and Harley-Davidson Works rider Cal Rayborn, who would go on to win that year's great race. The weekend wouldn't be so fortunate for Kawasaki, with many of their riders not being able to finish due to mechanical failures, whilst Rayborn managed to finish 4th in one of the support races. Thus, the relationship between Kawasaki and the color green would be born, as it would be adapted to their identity once the 70s had rolled around, when they had their great breakthrough beyond the showrooms. Kawasaki's first great feat with this color would come up in 1972, when they had offered a seat to CZ's rider Brad Lackey during the inaugural AMA Outdoor Motocross Championship, dominating the second half of the season to become the category's first champion, with Jimmy Weinert handing them their second crown 2 years later. And this was just the beginning, as Gary Nixon would go on to win the American Road Racing Championship with one of the so-called Green Minis. And later on, Kawasaki would assert their hegemony over the Australian and British championships, going as far as winning the ever-dangerous Isle of Man Tourist Trophy thanks to the likes of Mick Grant. Subsequently, the French-Swiss duo of Georges Gaudier and Alain Genoux would go on to revolutionize endurance racing with the Green Machines, by simplifying the choreographed process of pit stops with faster refueling, exchangeable fairings, and interchangeable parts for repairs, granting them 2 championships in a row and winning the ever-important Bol d'Eau 24-hour race. As if that wasn't enough, during the latter part of the decade, they would make their return to the World Championship, having abandoned their project a few years prior. With the likes of South Africa's Cork Ballington and Germany's Tony Monk, the Green Minis would become one of the most dominant bikes out of the entire field throughout the course of 5 seasons, with both riders winning a combined 55 races and 8 championship titles between 1978 and 1982. And right on the surge of superbike racing, Kawasaki would be present right from the start, having a very promising beginning in the American Championship, the green-colored machines later furthering their success thanks to the efforts of Eddie Lawson and Wayne Rainey. These 2 riders later on becoming world champions in Grand Prix racing. By this point, Kawasaki had conquered almost every single category imaginable, be it domestic or international, with work support or privately entered. However, out of all of the big races they hadn't conquered so far, one of them was still at the top of their list. That year's edition of the Great American Motorcycle Race would be one to remember, as the battle for the lead had become enclosed between 2 of the greatest American riders of the decade. One of them was arguably the favorite for this race, Doug Poland, who had caught his teeth in the American Superbike Championship, but as the 90s rolled around, he was offered a seat at Eraldo Ferrazzi's Ducati team, from which he received work support to compete in the World Superbike Championship the previous year, winning 17 of the 26 races, winning the title in the process, and more than willing to start the season with a bang at home. On the other hand, Scott Russell was becoming one of the greatest figures in the domestic scene, starting off the decade with a couple of national titles in the Supersport Championship as part of the dominant Mazi Kawasaki team at the time, making the jump to superbikes during the golden age of American motorcycle road racing. From start to finish, the fight for the lead would prevail against the varied field of riders, the crowd centered in the leading bikes which stole the show that evening in its entirety. The number 23 Ducati, its smooth power delivery and almighty torque from the V-twin complementing the calm and collected Poland, the world champion, competing against the ever-charging number 17 Kawasaki, its aggressive outburst coming from its 4 cylinders, and being tamed by the equally rough rider Russell the Hotshot ever was. Right on the final meters, however, it all seemed as though Poland was about to take his first Daytona win. But little did he know, the emerging Russell would make a slingshot pass, thus making the story of the Green Mean Machines come to a full circle. 23 years had passed ever since the very first moment they had made their daring presence at Daytona with the so-called jinxed green bikes, which, although with a less than stellar debut thanks to the litany of mechanical problems, had inadvertently created the brand's identity from that very moment, solidifying its presence as they rose to prominence throughout the years. Meanwhile, the decisive victory of Russell over Poland was truly a passing of the torch, as after the American Ducati star had won his second World Superbike title in a dominant fashion yet again, just about a year later, Russell had decided to go international full-time. And despite the fierce rivalry he had with British prospect Carl Fogarty, the Daytona story was bound to repeat itself, with Kawasaki beating Ducati in an incredible fashion, consolidating their presence in superbike racing for many years to come.